Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the 9th century Bengali poet Yogesvara. He was probably from Bengal, according to the introductory material in the Norton Anthology of World Literature, where I'm reading Yogesvara's work out of. He was patronized by a king in eastern India. As always, with the stuff in the with the poets in the Norton Anthology of World Literature, this is a very, very tiny selection of Yogesvara's work. But one of the things we see from the 7 poems we have here is his reputation as a poet of country life. He was very much interested in depicting the peasants, depicting poor people, depicting rural life. So we get this. And there's a lot of nature as well. There's a lot of natural elements, both things like weather, things like plants growing, but also in the sense of harvesting stuff. So harvesting shows up a lot in these poems as well. Again, it's rural poetry. This is pastoral in a sense, but not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily idealize in quite the same way that the European pastoral tradition tends to do. So for instance, in this one poem, he says, "The fields where sesamum," which is sesame, has ripened and now lies dry, delight the doves. The mustard turns to brown, its flowers giving way to fruit. The wind scatters the hemp and makes the body shiver with its drops of sleet. Travelers, quarreling in empty argument, huddle about the public fire." So we have here these interconnections of elements of rural life. On the one hand, the plants, the animal life, the doves that are eating bits of sesame, etc., etc., the life of the farm. But then we also have community, the mutual support, the comradeship of these travelers huddled about the public fire. And again, Yogesvara writes what we very often see in Sanskrit poetry, these subhasita poems. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I've said that in all my other videos about the Sanskrit poets, but these are very short poems that are image-driven, very visual, and they rely a lot on senses. I would compare subhasita, Sanskrit subhasita, to impressionist paintings. They give you a sense of the thing through vivid colors, etc., etc., vivid, striking images. And we get that a lot. For instance, in this other poem, "The warmth of their straw borne off by icy winds, time and again the peasants wake the fire, whose flame dies ever back, stirring with their sticks. From the smoking bank of mustard chaff, noisy with the crackling of the husks, a penetrating odor spreads to every corner of the threshing floor." So again, we've got these stark, vivid details, especially of warmth and of cold, of heat and of freezing, all tied up with the life of this rural community. It's connected to the activity of the peasants, stirring the fire to try and keep it alive, putting mustard chaff on the fire to fuel it, etc., etc. And this sort of battle that we get between remaining warm and the freezing temperatures the peasants are resisting. So we get a lot of these elements of the interactions of the natural world with human labor and how that sort of fits together in rural communities. But we also get some other things, some things that are more distinctively social commentary in some ways. So, for instance, with this poem, the last poem that the Norton Anthology gives us, it's, "When the rain pours down on the decrepit house, she dries the flooded barley grits and quiets the yelling children. She bails out water with a potsherd and saves the bedding straw. With a broken winnowing basket on her head, a poor man's wife is busy everywhere." So we have this element of gendered labor and this commentary on the work that poor women do. And that, I mean, this was true, certainly, I imagine, in 9th century Bengal, 9th century India, but this has been true always. I mean, in most societies across the world, women's labor has been continual. And for especially poor women, working class women, things like this, labor has often been incredibly difficult and has often been unrewarded or unrecognized. And Yogesvara here is drawing our attention to that labor. This is not necessarily a feminist poem in the sense that he's not necessarily saying, hey, everyone, let's recognize and honor women's labor. It's hard to tell from this particular poem whether this is meant to be a sort of uplifting, yay, rah, rah, I am woman, hear me roar type poem, or whether this is more like, again, like there's impressionist paintings of peasant women toiling in the fields, things like this. They're not necessarily like, let's make these women's lives better. They're just, here's peasant women doing peasant women stuff. It's hard to tell. We just, with such short poems, you don't get enough information to make this assessment. It's unlikely, I imagine, that this was a feminist poem in the way that we today in 2022 would tend to think of feminism. But there are some things that we can make a pretty reasonable assessment of their political or socio-cultural positions. This poem, for instance, "The days are sweet with ripening of sugar cane, the autumn rice is high, and Brahmins, being overfed at feasts to which the leading families invite them, find that the heat grows hard to bear." So this is a class satire. The Brahmins in the Indian caste system were the top of the tier. They were the most powerful political and religious class in the Hindu caste system. Here they're being presented as gluttons. They're being presented as so sort of soft that being around a fire is becoming difficult for them to bear, etc., etc. So, I mean, this is mockery of the people at the top of the social order by a poet whose primary focus seems to be on the lives of suffering working class peasants. So that's a very, very striking technique. That's a very, very striking approach to take, to have this kind of class satire. And remember, Yogesvara was a court poet, or he was at least a king was his patron. If you rely on the patronage of a king or on the patronage of nobility, writing poems mocking the nobility is a risky move. But he did it. So, good on you, Yogesvara. Fair play.